Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me on another episode of the Pollination Podcast. In episode 15, we'll be comparing the differences in feeding our honeybees cane sugar versus high fructose corn syrup. So it's that time of year again. If you're in the southeast United States, you're probably feeding your bees right now. In fact, you've probably been feeding them for probably all of this month of August, maybe even some of last month. We started selling high fructose corn syrup to the public last year, mostly large amounts to commercial beekeepers. But this year, I started selling it to pretty much anybody. We started selling it minimum 5-gallon increments. So a lot of hobby beekeepers have been curious about buying corn syrup from me, and I've had a lot of questions. And it just made me have to think a little bit about the questions and what I was going to tell them. And it sort of developed into a podcast episode. So maybe they'll listen to this and hopefully it'll be beneficial. Most hobby beekeepers and even smaller sideline beekeepers who don't need or can't afford to order full semi-loads of corn syrup to their house are probably just going to their local grocery store and buying bags of cane sugar to feed to their bees. We used to do this too for years. I used to get a second shopping cart and load it down at the grocery store with 25-pound bags of cane sugar. I got a lot of weird looks. A lot of people asked me if I was making moonshine. I think like every time I bought it, I guess they all thought I was making moonshine. I don't know. I felt very uncomfortable after a while of doing that. Most people aren't buying that much. They can buy a 25-pound bag and that'll feed a colony or two quite a bit. As some of you know, I started out on a commercial apiary right from the beginning when I was learning beekeeping, and they only fed their bees corn syrup, but I had just heard all these rumors that corn syrup was really bad for bees. It was toxic. It would shorten the queen's lifespan. It would damage brood. It was causing the bees to die out. And just in general, just a lot of vague rumors I would see online or hear from other beekeepers. But I was working for this apiary that was running 8,000 hives, and they were incredibly successful. And I never saw that, but That feeling that corn syrup was bad for honeybees was so ingrained in me, so deeply ingrained that I resisted it for years. I just kept going to the store and buying shopping carts of cane sugar. I just wouldn't even consider buying corn syrup to feed to my bees. Not to my bees. I wasn't going to do that because corn syrup is bad. I hear a lot of the same worries and concerns for these smaller beekeepers who are maybe thinking about using corn syrup to feed their bees for the first time. They've been doing cane sugar. They see me feeding it. They see me selling it. I get the occasional nasty message on Facebook that tells me I'm poisoning everybody's bees and I'm going to wipe out all the honeybees in North America because I'm feeding corn syrup in my small town. It's a little frustrating, but I know where they're coming from because I felt the same way. I had the same thoughts, the same fears. So I can put myself in their shoes, and I know they just don't know any better because they've never tried it, or they've just read something online, or they just have that weird rumor that's just constantly going around that corn syrup is just so bad for bees. And if you hear something enough times, you start to wonder, maybe it is true. Maybe I just don't understand what's happening. Maybe it really is bad for bees. Maybe these big commercial beekeepers just hate their bees and they don't care if they poison them because they just have so many and they'll make more. They're in it for the money. They hate the bees. But me, who has 1 or 2 hives, I love my bees. They're my pets. They're my family. And I only want the best for them. I understand that sentiment. And even as a commercial beekeeper, by the way, I feel the exact same way. I love each and every hive that I have. I get sick to my stomach every time I have to pinch a bad queen or I put a lid on and crush a couple honeybees. I feel sick. I'm not kidding. Sometimes for hours. It bothers me a lot. And we have sometimes as many as 2,000 colonies here. So yeah, you end up crushing a lot of bees. I pinch a lot of queens. So I would dispel the immediate rumor that commercial beekeepers don't care about their bees, because I promise you we wouldn't be doing this kind of work, because it usually sucks. Doesn't pay that well all the time. Not until you get really big. And you can lose everything in a blink of an eye. So I promise you commercial beekeepers, I would argue, love their bees more than a backyard beekeeper, because it's all we do. We do this 7 days a week, night, day. It's all I think about and can talk about is bees. So I knew that wasn't true once I got bigger, because I love my bees as much, if not more, than when I was a smaller beekeeper. With that being said, though, I didn't want to come across as too biased, because I do only feed my bees high fructose corn syrup. and I want to keep this podcast a little bit more scientific, although I definitely don't mind sharing my personal experiences. So I did dig around for a while, and I was able to find a scientific study from the year 2008 and 2009. It's titled Comparison of Productivity of Colonies of Honeybees, Apis mellifera, Supplemented with Sucrose or High Fructose Corn Syrup, published in the Journal of Insect Science. Corn syrup and high fructose corn syrup are actually two different things. Corn syrup is manufactured by adding enzymes to cornstarch. It's essentially 100% glucose. High fructose corn syrup was invented over a century later, and it was made by treating regular corn syrup with additional enzymes that convert some of the glucose to fructose. The most common type of high fructose corn syrup, and the kind that I buy and feed to my bees, is high fructose corn syrup 55, which is 55% fructose. Regular over-the-counter granulated cane sugar, which is what a lot of smaller beekeepers feed their bees, is comprised of 50% fructose and 50% glucose. Those two molecules are bound together to form sucrose, and sucrose is found naturally in many plants and nectar. Even though high fructose corn syrup contains 55% fructose, with the rest being comprised of glucose, the two molecules are not bound together. They remain separate. A honeybee's main source of energy is nectar, and nectar is comprised of sucrose, glucose, and fructose, as well as a mix of other simple sugars. When honeybees go out and collect nectar, the sucrose contained in the nectar is immediately broken down into fructose and glucose by their salivary glands. Honey is mostly comprised of high levels of fructose and glucose. So at least on a chemical level, high fructose corn syrup and granulated cane sugar are very similar. They're almost each 50% fructose and 50% glucose, more or less. The main difference, besides the fact where they're coming from, the plant they're originating from, is the fact that the sugar molecules in cane sugar are bound together and they remain separate in high fructose corn syrup. So the question is then, does that really matter? Does that impact the honeybees at all in a beneficial way or in a negative way? Questions about the safety of high fructose corn syrup as a feed for honeybees were raised almost immediately after it became available on the market. A lot of beekeepers began to report mixed results from feeding with it. Some researchers found decreased longevity in worker bees maintained in a laboratory on high fructose corn syrup as compared to honey. And in more recent studies of colony collapse disorder suggested there might be a negative effect from feeding high fructose corn syrup. There were reports of bees not feeding anymore or dying after being fed. High fructose corn syrup can cause other problems, such as the formation of toxins as a result of heat. What a lot of people think of when they think of corn syrup being toxic for honeybees is they're thinking of the chemical hydroxymethylfurfuryl, more commonly known as HMF, and much easier to say. It's a proven fact that when high fructose corn syrup is heated to temperatures of above 120 degrees for extended periods of time, it can produce the toxin HMF. That's a fact. At least in my area, 120 degrees Fahrenheit is not very hot. Our temperatures lately here in August have definitely been in the high 90s. The heat index has been definitely up to 120 degrees many times. And my corn syrup is stored in containers in mostly full sun. A lot of people know that fact, but what a lot of people don't know is that anything that contains high levels of fructose can also produce HMF if exposed to high temperatures for extended periods of time. That includes cane sugar syrup, and that includes even honey. I haven't bought one yet. It's on my to-buy list, but there's actually a test kit you can purchase online. I think it's a few $100 where you can actually sample high fructose corn syrup or honey or what have you, and it will actually detect what levels the HMF is at. I will say from my personal experience, since we've only been feeding our bees high fructose corn syrup for years, I leave them in large plastic totes, pretty much in direct sunlight in Florida heat. I have never personally witnessed any damaging effects from the syrup. We mix minimal of water in with the syrup, really just enough so my syrup pump doesn't get clogged up and blow up. And if I have some tanks that are sitting around for months, maybe like 6 months, I might add half a gallon or even a gallon of bleach to the syrup as well, just to stop it from fermenting. And I've definitely had syrup left over for probably close to a full year in direct sun, and I have never noticed any problems feeding the bees. I haven't noticed any damage to the brood. I haven't noticed an increase in queen failure, no high levels of dead bees. Honestly, really nothing. And in fact, I've got a tote of syrup that I bought last summer. I left it out there. It's turning a little bit yellow, and at least from what I've read myself online, when the syrup begins to gain a yellow tint, that's usually HMF inside of it. And that's one way apparently you're supposed to be able to tell. I haven't tested it, so I don't even know if that's true. But I've actually been feeding a little cluster of colonies, about 50 hives out here. Heck, I've been feeding all of my mini mating nukes all year round with that yellow syrup. I did add some water to it earlier this year, and I did dump in some bleach. But the mini nukes have been doing fine. The nukes that I have down here as well have been doing fine. I've really just seen no damage whatsoever. And I've got hives on the other side of the field in the same location where I'm feeding fresh syrup that I just bought. And honestly, I can't tell a difference at all between either group. That's just my personal experience. In the scientific study that I had mentioned previously, the researchers also took 2 groups of hives. They fed one group of hives strictly a diet of high fructose corn syrup, and they fed the other group of hives strictly a diet of sucrose syrup. Sucrose syrup would be like if you went out to the store and bought granulated cane sugar and mixed it with water. The researchers, after concluding the experiment, came to the conclusions that high fructose corn syrup and sucrose syrup both supported colony establishment and neither caused an acute toxic effect in the field, although sucrose syrup appeared to have a more stimulatory effect on colony establishment. The researchers found that high fructose corn syrup contains other complex sugars that might potentially be toxic to honeybees, or at least might be more difficult for the honeybees to metabolize and digest, and that might interfere with their ability to produce wax or bee bread, which would decrease the overall size of the brood nest. But they admit that further testing is needed, and it's just a hypothesis. The researchers do note that high fructose corn syrup is considered an acceptable bee feed, but they give a word of caution about storing it. They do mention that the presence of HMF is known to cause dark coloring to honey and is toxic to honeybees. They recommend that if you're going to use high fructose corn syrup, it should be stored in a temperature-controlled facility and not mixed with old, unused syrup or with water. They say that some commercial operations are now mixing high fructose corn syrup with sucrose syrup to help prevent the formation of HMF and mitigate the negative effects of high fructose corn syrup alone. The researchers also make an observation that honeybees that were fed diets of solely sucrose syrup tended to raise more brood compared to colonies that were fed a diet of only high fructose corn syrup, although it was a fairly marginal difference. The small difference in brood production, they really are only saying that it's going to make a difference if you're a commercial beekeeper and you're sending your bees to early almond pollination like I do, because it might give you a slight edge and offset the cost and the labor that it costs to mix and purchase sucrose syrup. They say that if high fructose corn syrup is used as the sole carbohydrate source during winter, there will be a decrease in brood production that could translate into a proportionally lower bee population overall. So for commercial operations, while high fructose corn syrup did no harm, beekeepers feeding sucrose syrup on a large scale may have a significantly higher overall return in large bee populations. So my understanding of this study is that the researchers are clearly stating that sucrose syrup is overall better for honeybee colony health in the sense that it can increase the population, might increase honeybee longevity, and you don't have to fight against the toxic effects of HMF that come with high fructose corn syrup. However, the numbers that they're stating that sucrose syrup is increasing the colony populations by or increasing the longevity of the honeybee by are really small. They even went as far as measuring the amount of beeswax produced from colonies fed high fructose corn syrup compared to sucrose syrup, and it's a really marginal difference. So the way I see it is, yes, sucrose syrup is better than high fructose corn syrup for the honeybees. There doesn't seem to be a strong argument against that fact. However, because the increases in honeybee health are pretty small, and because I have never, as far as I know, had any problems with HMF, and I don't store my corn syrup in any sort of climate-controlled building whatsoever, I'm just not really convinced. I'm probably a little bit biased, I know, but I really was for full-on sucrose syrup for many years. And I'll tell you, the reason I've converted over is because at the end of the day, I'm running a business. I'm running a commercial honeybee business. I have a very tight budget. As far as I've found, mixing sucrose or cane sugar, we used to buy it in bags of like 2,000-pound bags and have it delivered by multiple 2,000-pound bags. I would mix it by hand. I would get a little heater and heat up the water in a container, and then I would pick up 2,000-pound bags with my bobcat and cut a hole with a knife and drain it in there, and then I would mix it by hand with this old canoe paddle. Man, and I would do that every single day for hours, to the point your arms are burning, they're falling off. I even built a small pump to help churn the water as I was mixing it, but it honestly didn't make much of a difference. And if you didn't mix it really, really, really well, or you let it sit too long, the water and the sugar would separate. On top of the fact that that sugar was quite a bit more expensive from what I remember than just buying a tanker load of corn syrup. When that tanker of corn syrup pulls up to my house, if I'm really in a rush and I've got hives that are starving, and I usually do that time of year because I'm always just running behind like normal, I can have an empty container on the back of my flatbed truck, have that syrup semi-driver pump it straight into the containers on the back of my truck that are already strapped, ready to go, have a little water mixed in with my syrup pump on the back, and I can haul butt out of there right into the bee yard and just dump hundreds of gallons of feed out to my bees in a day. You can't do that with cane sugar. You just can't do it. You're going to get those massive bags, and sometimes the factories, they send you old bags that are solid. There's been many a time I've had to take a sledgehammer to a 2,000-pound block of cane sugar and beat it to pieces long before I could even mix it up, which took usually overnight for me to mix it properly. So that's just something you have to think of. And if you've only got a few hives, yeah, based off this study, go ahead and just continue to go to the store and buy you a few bags of cane sugar. It seems to be the way to go. But eventually, if you want to grow, if you want to be a sideliner or a commercial beekeeper, you're going to get faced with the fact that that cane sugar is more expensive financially right off the bat. It's going to cost you more when you buy it. You're going to lose a lot more time in mixing this stuff. And if you're hiring employees, you're going to have to factor in labor costs. That's just not there. Your time and your labor is almost nothing when you get corn syrup. That's just something you're going to have to factor in if you want to run a business. And you'll come to the same place I did, where you're just going to look and you're like, well, I can go to cane sugar because it's better. Or I can go to corn syrup because it's cheaper and more effective for my business. And that's where I got 2 years ago. And I tell you, I've just gone corn syrup, and it's been one of the best decisions I made for the business. I don't think I will ever go back to mixing cane sugar. I mean, maybe some new science will come out and it'll change my mind. Maybe tomorrow I'll go look at those colonies that I fed that old syrup to and they'll be dead, and I'll come back here and change my mind. But I just don't see it happening. I really think corn syrup, and I mean high fructose corn syrup, is just the way to go if you're going to be a commercial beekeeper. And it also doesn't have to be so black and white. You can do a combination of both. When I worked for a large apiary, they tried that for a while. I remember we tried it for a couple years. During the spring, colonies that weren't producing honey, we would mix sugar water, like sucrose syrup, by hand and go feed the bees. And then fall and winter, we would feed them the high fructose corn syrup because it was thicker. It was more similar to that 2-to-1 ratio a lot of people were looking for the winter to put weight on the hives. And honestly, it still kind of sucked because they were running 15,000 hives. Bees were starving all the time. Myself or, the new guys that had just started, we usually got on syrup duty. So they would have these huge vats, kind of like I did here, on a small scale, where you would just mix in the cane sugar with water, churn it with a pump, use old canoe paddles, soaked in syrup. And about as fast as you can mix it, there was like 3 or 4 other beekeepers waiting to take it from you. They needed 1,000 gallons a day or several thousand gallons a day. In fact, one truck would put out, probably 600 gallons of syrup a day. And they might have 4 trucks sitting there waiting on you to mix that syrup up. And what was happening is the colonies were dying. They were starving to death. It just wasn't worth it financially. It was like, why? Well, you can just have that corn syrup semi sitting in here. Most of the time, the semis will arrive before we would even get there to work. So as soon as we pulled up, we could load our trucks up with syrup and go out and feed. And you save so much money. And the bees did better because they just had a food right away. Super high calories. So I don't know. I feel a little biased with this episode. I think I am. I'm definitely making the argument for high fructose corn syrup in light of the fact that this study is telling you that sucrose syrup is better. But yeah, I guess that's just kind of going with my opinion on that one. But I think really the answer is, just like I say in almost every episode, find what works best for you as a beekeeper, for you and your bees, and your goals for the business. But don't hate on somebody because they use high fructose corn syrup, just like I don't hate on people who go out and buy bags at Walmart or accuse me of poisoning honeybees. I try not to take it personal because we're all at different stages in our beekeeping careers and our beekeeping lives, and we're all growing and learning. I think really we just need more data on this. There just doesn't really seem to be a really clear answer on the science one way or another. So yeah, that's my thoughts on high fructose corn syrup versus sucrose syrup. I know that was kind of rambly and long, but I don't know. It's hard for me to come to a clear conclusion on this topic, but hopefully at least gave you something to think about. Definitely let me know what you guys think as well. I'm always open to hearing your opinions, and I appreciate the messages when I do get them. I really do read everything that you guys send me. And thank you so much. And I guess I'll see you next month when I release the next episode of the Pollination Podcast. Bye. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Pollination Podcast. I'm Matthew Walker from Walk in the Woods Apiary. We hope we have answered a few of your beekeeping and pollinator questions. Please share your questions and comments to our Facebook page at the Pollination Podcast.